Harper Audio presents The Great Unraveling, written and read by Paul Krugman. Preface. Metaphors can be tricky things, but Manhattan's debt clock is as good as they come. A public-spirited businessman installed the clock in 1989, hoping to shame politicians into acting responsibly. Huge numerals counted off the ever-rising national debt. Ever rising because each year the federal government spent far more than it took in and was forced to borrow the difference. But in the late 1990s, a funny thing happened. The government's tax take soared along with the stock market, and those mammoth budget deficits first shrank, then turned into record surpluses. In September 2000, the owner of the clock pulled the plug. In July 2002, with the nation once again facing deficits as far as the eye could see, he turned it back on. There's much more to recent American history than the way the federal government declared victory in its long struggle against deficits, only to see the red ink quickly return. But as the budget went, so went many other indicators of our national well-being. In the early 1990s, we were a depressed nation, economically, socially, and politically. A best-selling book of the era was titled America, What Went Wrong? By the end of the decade, we had, it seemed, pulled ourselves together. The economy was booming, jobs were plentiful, and millions of people were getting rich. Budget deficits had given way to record surpluses. The long crime wave that began in the 1960s came to an end. Major cities were suddenly, amazingly, safer than they had been for many decades. The future seemed almost incredibly bright. Then the good times stopped rolling. By 2003, the fabric of our economy, and perhaps of our political system and our society, seemed once again to be unraveling. The nation was gripped by anxiety, with polls showing a majority of the public feeling that the country was headed in the wrong direction. This audiobook is, first of all, a chronicle of the years when it all went wrong again, when the heady optimism of the late 1990s gave way to renewed gloom. It's also an attempt to explain the how and why. How it was possible for a country with so much going for it to go downhill so fast, and why our leaders made such bad decisions. For this is, in large part, a story about leadership, incredibly bad leadership, in the private sector and in the corridors of power. And yes, it is in particular an indictment of George W. Bush. Helen Thomas, the veteran White House correspondent, has called Mr. Bush the worst president in all of American history. I'm not sure about that. He has some stiff competition. But the really terrible presidents of the past led a nation in which presidential incompetence and malfeasance mattered far less either to the nation or to the world than it does today. Most of this audiobook consists of columns that I wrote for the New York Times between January 2000 and January 2003. I hope that listeners will find that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, that taken together these columns tell a coherent story. I'll talk shortly about how I came to write those columns. But first, let's recall the background. The dreary years. During the late 1990s, as everything seemed to be going right, as jobs proliferated, stocks soared, budgets moved into surplus, and even the crime rate plunged, the dreary mood of the decade's early years faded from memory. By 2000, few people remembered the national funk that prevailed in 1992. Yet that funk is essential background to what came later. If you are one of those people who thinks that national greatness is defined by military success, and such people are running the country right now, the nation's foul mood in 1992 may seem puzzling. Militarily, America was on top of the world. Communism had collapsed. A war in the Persian Gulf that many had feared would become another Vietnam turned instead into a spectacular demonstration of American military prowess. We had already become what we remain today, the world's one and only superpower. But glory doesn't pay the bills. A tagline of the time, drawing attention to the contrast between American stagnation and the seemingly relentless rise of Japan, said, "The Cold War is over. Japan won." Whether or not you bought the thesis that America was the victim of unfair Japanese competition, it wasn't. It was a time of national disillusionment. Though Japan wasn't the villain some people imagined, and it was soon to experience economic setbacks that are a cautionary tale for all of us, America's economic woes were real enough. True, by 1992, statisticians had declared the recession of 1990 to 1991 over. But in 1991 to 1992, it was still a jobless recovery. That is, a period in which GDP grows, but unemployment continues to rise. As far as ordinary Americans were concerned, it was a continuing recession. Nor were things all that great for workers who managed to keep their jobs. The real wage of the typical worker had been stagnant or falling for almost 20 years. Traditional industries, like autos and steel, in which ordinary workers could earn good wages, seemed to be in steady decline. Poverty was rising, not falling. More than 20% of children were living below the poverty line, the highest fraction since 1964. Popular culture reflected a deep sense of disillusionment. Among the big movies of the early 90s were Falling Apart, about a laid-off worker who erupts in rage, Grand Canyon, about the menace of crime, about a laid-off worker who erupts in rage, Grand Canyon, about the menace of crime, and Rising Sun, about American decline and the rise of Japan. What about the promise of new technology? In the early 1990s, this seemed like a promise broken. For sure, new technology was all around us, but it didn't seem to be delivering much in the way of results. More and more workers were equipped with computers. Every office had a fax machine. Cell phones and email were starting to become widespread, but none of it seemed to pay off in employment or higher living standards. One prominent economist, he would later be a notable American triumphalist, told me privately that he regarded high-tech as high bull. Above all, the American people were disillusioned with their leaders, private and public. Every airport bookstore featured rows of volumes with samurai warriors on their covers, promising to teach readers the secrets of Japanese management. The point was not just that the Japanese seemingly knew how to run modern corporations, but that the people running American companies seemingly didn't. All the latest gadgets seemed to come from Japan. Not only had made in the USA ceased to be a guarantee of quality, many consumers had come to distrust domestic products. CEOs of major corporations were mocked as bumbling, overpaid incompetents. When President George Bush took auto company executives to Japan to demand economic concessions, the affair turned into a public relations disaster. The loss of respect extended to our politicians. The most remarkable thing about the 1992 election wasn't that Bush lost. It was that H. Ross Perot, a candidate completely out of the mainstream, took 19% of the vote. In a nation where third parties have never flourished, that was a huge vote of no confidence in conventional political leaders. In short, it wasn't the best of times, and many observers expected things to keep getting worse. Yet over the next 8 years, the nation would experience an amazing economic and social turnaround. The good years. It took quite a while before people realized that things had really turned for the better. You might say that pessimism had become a national habit. As late as the winter of 1995-6, despite a steadily falling unemployment rate, the newspapers were full of alarmist headlines about job loss and downsizing. In the 1996 presidential campaign, Bob Dole's economists attacked the Clinton administration for what they claimed was a sluggish, below-par economic recovery. Less partisan economists knew better, but they remained cautious, having seen too many false dawns. Yet eventually, the evidence became too strong to deny. The U.S. economy really was on the mend, and so, it began to seem, was our society. Given our current state of renewed disillusionment, it's tempting to dismiss everything that went right in the Clinton years as a mirage. Indeed, the manic optimism of the late 90s got ahead of the reality. But the nation's real achievements were spectacular. First and foremost, for the lives of most people, by the end of the 90s, jobs were plentiful, more plentiful than they had been for decades. Between 1992 and 2000, U.S. payrolls rose by 22 million, driving the unemployment rate to a 30-year low. Full employment meant jobs and a chance of escape for families that had been caught in the poverty trap. Poverty rates fell sharply for the first time since the 1960s. Partly as a consequence, social indicators like crime rates showed spectacular improvement. By the end of the 90s, New York was as safe as it had been in the mid-1960s. If job growth was impressive, the increase in productivity, the amount produced per worker, was even more impressive. In the 1970s and 1980s, low productivity growth, barely 1% per year, was the greatest failing of the U.S. economy. Poor productivity performance was the most important reason why living standards stagnated for typical American families. An economy without productivity growth can't deliver a sustained rise in wages. But during the 1990s, productivity took off. By decade's end, it was rising faster than ever before in American history, and wages had ended their long stagnation. Why did productivity surge? The main answer, probably, was that information technology had come of age. All those computers and networks were finally showing what they could do. But business leaders, understandably, took much of the credit. As Japan faltered, American business regained its confidence, and American businessmen became heroes. It was the age of the CEO as superstar. And if those superstars took home supersized paychecks, why not? America, it seemed, had devised a system in which big incentives produced big results. Then there was the stock market. At the end of 1992, the Dow was at 3,500. By 2000, it had zoomed past 10,000. And yet Dow investors felt like losers. They had missed out on the really big gains, as tech stocks made many people instant millionaires. Not since 1929, and maybe not even then, had quick wealth seemed so attainable. And authoritative-sounding voices assured us that there was more to come, that the Dow would soon reach 36,000. There were stock market skeptics. I was one of them. I also had some initial doubts about the U.S. productivity miracle. By 2000, I was a believer, but I still thought stock prices were way out of line. And those of us who followed foreign economies also worried a bit about what would happen when the stock market rediscovered the law of gravity. There were some undeniable similarities between the U.S. economy in the late 90s and Japan's bubble economy a decade earlier. And after Japan's stock market bubble collapsed, the seemingly unstoppable Japanese economy fell into a profound funk, which has continued to this day. Yet the 90s had given us reason for optimism, even if the bubble burst. For the problems of Japan had been exacerbated by poor leadership, and the economic leadership of the United States was exceptionally good. In the early years of the Clinton administration, this wasn't clear to everyone. I myself was a pretty harsh critic of the new president's economic team in the days before the ascendancy of Robert Rubin was fully established. But by decade's end, Rubinomics was triumphant. First, Clinton dared to raise taxes to help close the budget deficit, an action that was doubly brave. His predecessor, George Bush, had been vilified for his own tax increase, though even Ronald Reagan had retracted part of his own tax cut. And conservatives predicted that the Clinton tax increase would sink the economy. Nonetheless, he did the right thing and got a booming economy and a budget surplus as his reward. Moreover, Washington proved itself flexible and effective in dealing with crises. When the Mexican peso plunged in 1995, the administration, again braving harsh criticism from the right, came to our neighbor's rescue. Then an even bigger financial crisis erupted in Asia. In the fall of 1998, the crisis spread to the U.S., as Russia's default on its debt led to the downfall of long-term capital management, a huge hedge fund. Financial markets briefly seized up. Borrowing and lending came to a virtual halt. I was at a meeting in which one Fed official briefed us on the situation. When asked what we could do, he replied, "Pray." Yet Rubin, together with Alan Greenspan, managed to exude a sense of calm. Remember what it was like when people actually admired the Treasury Secretary? And the markets recovered. Early in 1999, the cover of Time featured Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin, and Deputy Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, whom it dubbed, cornily but with considerable justification, the Committee to Save the World. At the beginning of the new millennium, then, it seemed that the U.S. was blessed with mature, skillful economic leaders, who in a pinch would do what had to be done. They would insist on responsible fiscal policies. They would act quickly and effectively to prevent a repeat of the jobless recovery of the early 90s, let alone a slide into Japanese-style stagnation. Even those of us who considered ourselves pessimists were basically optimists. We thought that bullish investors might face a rude awakening, but that it would all have a happy ending. America, what went wrong? The satirical weekly The Onion describes itself as America's finest news source, and for the last few years that has been the literal truth. The mock news story for January 18, 2001, reported a speech in which President-elect George W. Bush declared, "Our long national nightmare of peace and prosperity is over." And so it has turned out. What happened to the good years? For many people, the great emotional turning point, the moment when their dreams of security were shattered, was September 11th, 2001. But for me, the turn was slower and broader than that. I don't mean to belittle the horror, but anyone who followed Middle Eastern events knew that the U.S. was a terrorist target. You may remember that at first everyone assumed that the 1995 bombing in Oklahoma City involved Muslims. Experts on terrorism warned us repeatedly over the years that there would someday be a major attack on U.S. soil, though the sheer size of the mass murder on September 11th was a shock. We knew that there were people out there who wanted to hurt us. It wasn't that much of a surprise when they finally scored a hit. The real surprise was the failure of leadership, private and public, right here at home. Some people realized that there were business excesses in the 1990s, though they had a hard time getting themselves heard. But the extent and brazenness of the excesses was greater than anyone realized. The bull market, we learned too late, both encouraged and concealed corporate misbehavior on an epic scale. Who could have imagined that famous companies, lauded in business schools as the very models of a major modern corporation, would turn out to be little more than Ponzi schemes? Actually, some people did say that, but they were dismissed as cranks. Even more troubling was the revelation that our political system was far less mature than we thought, that the responsible leadership we had come to take for granted had been a sort of accident. In the 2000 campaign, George W. Bush offered a tax plan and a Social Security plan that were obviously, blatantly based on bogus arithmetic. Yet the media focused on the politics of personality and avoided explaining the issues. Meanwhile, Alan Greenspan turned out not to be who we thought he was. The stern advocate of austerity and fiscal discipline when a Democrat was in office became an apologist and enabler for irresponsible tax cuts, even in the face of soaring deficits, once the White House had changed hands. Moreover, the new team showed neither the long-run responsibility nor the short-term flexibility of its predecessors. The original Bush economic plan involved big, long-run tax cuts that phased in only gradually. By 2002, it was clear that this plan had it backwards. Like his father, Bush was presiding over a jobless recovery, that is, an economy that was growing, but too slowly to provide new jobs, so that most people found their lives getting worse. This economy badly needed a short-term boost, not a long-run tax cut. And the spectacular deterioration of the budget meant that long-run tax cuts were no longer remotely affordable. Yet Bush's aides continued to insist that their program, formulated back in 1999 at the height of the bubble, was exactly the right solution for the economy's current difficulties. And in early 2003, when they finally seemed to realize that something more was needed, the new stimulus plan was practically a clone of the original plan. Hardly anything to stimulate the economy now, but lots of long-term tax cuts, mainly for the rich. More ominously, it gradually became clear that something deeper than mere bad economic ideology was at work. The big story of America's political sea change is the subject of this audiobook's introduction. Meanwhile, I was in the unpleasant position of having to chronicle the rising tide of bad news. Why me? I began writing for the New York Times in January 2000. Neither I nor the Times knew what I was getting into. I was and am an economics professor by trade. International financial crises were one of my main specialties, and I spent much of the 1990s tracking and commenting on disasters abroad. Some of my work consisted of what I call Greek letter economics, abstruse papers for the professional journals. But I also wrote about global economic issues for a wider audience. By 1998, I had 2 regular monthly columns, one in Fortune and one in the online magazine Slate. Some of those columns are included in this collection. In the summer of 1999, the New York Times contacted me about writing for the paper's op-ed page. Howell Raines, then the paper's editorial page editor, felt that in an age when, more than ever, the business of America was business, the Times needed to broaden its op-ed commentary beyond the traditional focus on foreign affairs and domestic politics. I was brought on in the expectation that I would write about the vagaries of the new economy, the impacts of globalization, and bad policies in other countries. I didn't expect to spend a lot of time on domestic politics, since everyone assumed that American policy would remain sensible and responsible. I've tried, as best I can, to cover economics and business. As you'll see, some of the columns in this book are straight economic analyses, without a political edge. But as events unfolded, politics inevitably intruded. More and more, I found myself speaking very uncomfortable truth to power. Why me? These days, I often find myself accused of being a knee-jerk liberal, even a socialist. But just a few years ago, the real knee-jerk liberals didn't like me at all. One magazine even devoted a cover story to an attack on me for my pro-capitalist views, and I still have the angry letter Ralph Nader sent me when I criticized his attacks on globalization. If I have ended up, more often than not, writing pieces that attack the right wing, it's because the right wing now rules, and rules badly. It's not just that the policies are bad and irresponsible. Our leaders lie about what they are up to. I began pointing out the outrageous dishonesty of the Bush administration long before most of the rest of the punditocracy. Why did I see what others failed to see? One reason is that as a trained economist, I wasn't even for a minute tempted to fall into the he said, she said style of reporting, under which opposing claims by politicians are given equal credence regardless of the facts. I did my own arithmetic, or, where necessary, got hold of real economists who could educate me on the subjects I wrote about, and quickly realized that we were dealing with world-class mendacity right here in the USA. I wasn't entirely alone in this. One thing I've noticed the last few years is that business reporters, who know a bogus number when they see one, have often accused our leaders of outrageous mendacity, even while political pundits celebrate those leaders for their supposed sterling character. But the writings of business reporters necessarily have a narrow focus and rarely affect political commentary. With a wider brief and a spot on the op-ed page, I attracted a lot more attention. I have also been willing to see things differently and report on what I see because I'm not properly socialized. The commentariat mainly consists of people who live in Washington and go to the same dinner parties. This in itself foments groupthink. At any given moment, there is a storyline that shapes journalists' perceptions. Until September 11th, this storyline had it that George W. Bush was dumb but honest. After September 11th, the news story was that he was a tough-minded hero, all determination and moral clarity, Texas Ranger to the world. Yes, one prominent pundit actually wrote that. The overwhelming evidence that neither of these pictures bore any resemblance to reality was simply brushed aside. But I'm not part of the gang. I work from central New Jersey and continue to live the life of a college professor, so I never bought into the shared assumptions. Moreover, I couldn't be bullied in the usual ways. The stock in trade of most journalists is inside information, leaks from highly placed sources, up-close and personal interviews with the powerful. This leaves them vulnerable. They can be seduced with offers of special access, threatened with the career-destroying prospect that they will be frozen out. But I rely almost entirely on numbers and analyses that are in the public domain. I don't need to be in the good graces of top officials, so I also have no need to display the deference that characterizes many journalists. Whatever the reason, I have spent much of the last 3 years providing a picture of the world that differs greatly from the vision of most other mainstream pundits. Web-based commentators have done yeoman duty, but they don't land on a million doorsteps twice a week. One of the columns in this audiobook is titled An Alternate Reality. That about captures it. At a time when most pundits were celebrating the bold vision, skill, and moral clarity of our leaders, I saw confusion, ineffectuality, and dishonesty. It wasn't a popular point of view, especially in the early months after September 11th. But have I been right? Listen to this audiobook and decide for yourself. About this audiobook. I've tried to make this audiobook more than a chronological sequence of columns. There is, of course, an element of chronology. Each column was written on a particular date, and my views on some subjects have evolved as new facts have come to light. But the columns are grouped according to major themes, and within each theme into chapters that focus on a particular subject. I've also added an introduction that sets the political stage, and further additional material at the beginning of each thematic section to put the columns into a broader perspective. The columns begin with the rise and fall of America's stock market bubble, with all that went with it. As the pieces here show, I was always a stock market skeptic, though not, as you'll see, skeptical enough. My focus on troubled economies abroad prepared me for the possibility that the U.S. would suffer serious economic difficulties once the bubble burst, though here again I initially understated the risks. What nobody realized was how thoroughly corrupted the U.S. corporate system had become. Like everyone else, I played catch-up here. The audiobook turns next to the federal budget and the fate of Social Security. It's the story of a debt foretold. From the beginning, it was obvious to me that George W. Bush's plans didn't add up, and that he and his people were simply lying about all the important numbers, and that their plans would dissipate the budget surplus. It has played out just as I feared, but sooner and more forcefully than I expected. As I read these words, the administration has just conceded that the $230 billion surplus it inherited has been converted into a $300 billion deficit, and you know that's an underestimate. How was such a misstep possible? In Part 3, I go beyond economics pure and simple, trying to understand what has gone wrong with American politics. It seems to me now that many reasonable people, liberals and conservatives alike, still don't get it. As I explain in these columns, the real world of politics is much tougher and uglier than the picture most of us carry in our heads. The last few years didn't just shake my faith in our political system. They were also a reminder that free markets, while often a very good thing, can sometimes go very badly wrong. Part 4 describes some of the shocking failures of the market system in the last few years, from the California energy crisis to the catastrophe in Argentina. Of course, there's more to the world, even the world of economics, than the ups and downs of the United States. The book concludes with a wider view, a look at the global economy and at the tools we use to understand it. This is not, I'm sorry to say, a happy book. It's mainly about economic disappointment, bad leadership, and the lies of the powerful. Don't despair. Nothing has gone wrong in America that can't be repaired. But the first step in that repair job is understanding where and how the system got broken. Introduction. A Revolutionary Power, April 10th, 2003. A lot has happened these past 3 years. Stock market decline and business scandal, energy crisis and environmental backsliding, budget deficits and recession, terrorism and troubled alliances, and now, finally, war. I've written about all these things, mainly from an economic point of view. But as I explained in the preface, to talk about economics requires more and more that one write about politics. And there's a political story that runs through much of what has happened to this country lately, the story of the rise and growing dominance of a radical political movement right here in the USA. I'm talking, of course, about America's radical right, a movement that now effectively controls the White House, Congress, much of the judiciary, and a good slice of the media. The dominance of that movement changes everything. Old rules about politics and policy no longer apply. In this introduction, I want to offer an overview of that rise and the difference it makes. A political sea change. Most people have been slow to realize just how awesome a sea change has taken place in the domestic political scene. During the 2000 election, many people thought that nothing much was at stake. During the first 2 years of the Bush administration, many pundits insisted that the radically conservative bent of that administration was only a temporary maneuver, that Bush would tack back to the center after solidifying his base. And the public still has little sense of how radical our leading politicians really are. A striking example, in the fall of 2001, when focus groups were asked to react to Republican proposals for a retroactive corporate tax cut, the proposal described in my column, The One-Eyed Man, in Chapter 10, members of the focus groups literally refused to believe the group leader's description of the policy. For reasons described in the preface, I was ahead of the curve in realizing that something radical was happening. As a professional economist, I was in a position to appreciate the disconnect between official claims and reality. As a media outsider, I wasn't part of the Washington culture, in which it's considered bad form to suggest that leading politicians have ulterior motives that bear little resemblance to their stated goals. But looking at the wreckage, I realized that I, too, didn't realize how far things would go. To take the most straightforward example, in 2001, even many liberals thought that one shouldn't make too much fuss about Bush's fiscal irresponsibility. The tax cut isn't a good idea, they said, but it isn't all that important. But by 2003, we saw the unprecedented spectacle of an administration proposing huge additional tax cuts, not just in the face of record deficits, but in the middle of a war. Nothing is more important in the face of a war than cutting taxes, declared House Majority Leader Tom DeLay. Another example. Those who suggested that Republicans would exploit September 11th for political advantage were widely denounced for undermining national unity. Yet they did. Indeed, during the 2002 election campaign, Republican supporters ran ads linking Democratic Senator Tom Daschle with Saddam Hussein. What is happening? And why have most people been so slow to come to grips with the reality? Just before putting this book to bed, I discovered a volume that describes the situation almost perfectly. It's not a new book by a liberal writing about contemporary America. It's an old book by, of all people, Henry Kissinger, about 19th century diplomacy. A Revolutionary Power. Back in 1957, Henry Kissinger, then a brilliant iconoclastic young Harvard scholar, with his eventual career as cynical political manipulator, and later as crony capitalist still far in the future, published his doctoral dissertation, A World Restored. One wouldn't think that a book about the diplomatic efforts of Metternich and Castlereagh is relevant to U.S. politics in the 21st century. But the first 3 pages of Kissinger's book sent chills down my spine because they seem all too relevant to current events. In those first few pages, Kissinger describes the problems confronting a heretofore stable diplomatic system when it is faced with a revolutionary power, a power that does not accept that system's legitimacy. Since the book is about the reconstruction of Europe after the Battle of Waterloo, the revolutionary power he had in mind was the France of Robespierre and Napoleon, though he clearly, if implicitly, drew parallels with the failure of diplomacy to effectively confront totalitarian regimes in the 1930s. Note, drawing parallels does not mean claiming moral equivalence. It seems clear to me that one should regard America's right-wing movement, which now in effect controls the administration, both houses of Congress, much of the judiciary, and a good slice of the media, as a revolutionary power in Kissinger's sense. That is, it is a movement whose leaders do not accept the legitimacy of our current political system. Am I overstating the case? In fact, there's ample evidence that key elements of the coalition that now runs the country believe that some long-established American political and social institutions should not, in principle, exist, and do not accept the rules that the rest of us have taken for granted. Consider, for example, the welfare state as we know it. New Deal programs like Social Security and unemployment insurance, Great Society programs like Medicare. If you read the literature emanating from the Heritage Foundation, which drives the Bush administration's economic ideology, you discover a very radical agenda. Heritage doesn't just want to scale back New Deal and Great Society programs. It regards the very existence of those programs as a violation of basic principles. Or consider foreign policy. Since World War II, the United States has built its foreign policy around international institutions and has tried to make it clear that it is not an old-fashioned imperialist power which uses military force as it sees fit. But if you follow the foreign policy views of the neoconservative intellectuals who fomented the war with Iraq, you learn that they have contempt for all that. Richard Perle, chairman of a key Pentagon advisory board, dismissed the liberal conceit of safety through international law administered by international institutions. They aren't hesitant about the use of force. One prominent thinker close to the administration, Michael Ledeen of the American Enterprise Institute, declared that we are a warlike people and we love war. The idea that war in Iraq is just a pilot project for a series of splendid little wars seemed at first a leftist fantasy. But many people close to the administration have made it clear that they regard this war as only a beginning. And a senior State Department official, John Bolton, told Israeli officials that after Iraq, the U.S. would deal with Syria, Iran, and North Korea. Nor is even that the whole story. The separation of church and state is one of the fundamental principles of the U.S. Constitution. But Tom DeLay, the House Majority Leader, has told constituents that he is in office to promote a biblical worldview, and that his relentless pursuit of Bill Clinton was motivated by Clinton's failure to share that view. DeLay has also denounced the teaching of evolution in schools, going so far as to blame that teaching for the Columbine school shootings. There's even some question about whether the people running the country accept the idea that legitimacy flows from the democratic process. Paul Gigot of the Wall Street Journal famously praised the bourgeois riot in which violent protesters shut down a vote recount in Miami. The rioters, it was later revealed, weren't angry citizens. They were paid political operatives. Meanwhile, according to his close friend Don Evans, now the Secretary of Commerce, George W. Bush believes that he was called by God to lead the nation. Perhaps this explains why the disputed election of 2000 didn't seem to inspire any caution or humility on the part of the victors. Consider Justice Antonin Scalia's response to a student who asked how he felt making the Supreme Court decision that threw the election to Bush. Was it agonizing? Did Scalia worry about the consequences? No. It was a wonderful feeling, he declared. Suppose, for a moment, that you took the picture I have just painted seriously. You would conclude that the people now in charge really don't like America as it is. If you combine their apparent agendas, the goal would seem to be something like this: a country that basically has no social safety net at home, which relies mainly on military force to enforce its will abroad, in which schools don't teach evolution but do teach religion, and, possibly, in which elections are only a formality. Yet those who take the hardline rightists now in power at their word and suggest that they may really attempt to realize such a radical goal are usually accused of being shrill, of going over the top. Surely, says the conventional wisdom, we should discount the rhetoric. The goals of the right are more limited than this picture suggests. Or are they? Back to Kissinger. His description of the baffled response of established powers in the face of a revolutionary challenge works equally well as an account of how the American political and media establishment has responded to the radicalism of the Bush administration over the past 2 years. Lulled by a period of stability, which had seemed permanent, they find it nearly impossible to take at face value the assertion of the revolutionary power that it means to smash the existing framework. The defenders of the status quo therefore tend to begin by treating the revolutionary power as if its protestations were merely tactical, as if it really accepted the existing legitimacy but overstated its case for bargaining purposes, as if it were motivated by specific grievances to be assuaged by limited concessions. Those who warn against the danger in time are considered alarmists. Those who counsel adaptation to circumstance are considered balanced and sane. But it is the essence of a revolutionary power that it possesses the courage of its convictions, that it is willing, indeed eager, to push its principles to their ultimate conclusion. As I said, this passage sent chills down my spine because it explains so well the otherwise baffling process by which the administration has been able to push radical policies through with remarkably little scrutiny or effective opposition. To elaborate, let me talk about two big examples: the tax cuts of 2001 and the Iraq War of 2003. Tax cuts and war. War and economic policy seem, on the surface, to have little in common, and in normal times they play very differently on the political scene. Yet there was a striking similarity between the selling of Bush's tax cuts and the selling of his Iraq War. Chapters 5 and 6 tell the story of the 2001 tax cut. Let me give a preview. Candidate Bush introduced his original tax cut proposal in 1999 to solidify his right-wing credentials and fend off a Republican primary challenge from Steve Forbes. Anyone familiar with recent political history knew that Forbes represented a wing of the Republican Party that always wants more tax cuts for the rich, regardless of economic circumstances. After all, Republican leaders in Congress tried to pass big tax cuts every year during the 1990s, through good times and bad times, deficit and surplus. A clear-eyed assessment should have been that Bush had signed on to that position, and thus that his goals were very radical, as they have turned out to be. As Dan Altman of the New York Times points out, if you take the administration's tax proposals as a group, they effectively achieve a long-standing goal of the radical right. An end to all taxes on income from capital, moving us to a system in which only wages are taxed. A system, if you like, in which earned income is taxed, but unearned income is not. The point is that on the matter of taxes, the right had more or less declared its intention to, as Kissinger put it, smash the existing framework, in this case, the framework of the American tax system as we know it. Yet the American political and media establishment couldn't believe that Bush would really try to achieve that goal. Despite the evident radicalism of the people behind the Bush policy, moderates convinced themselves that Bush's aims were limited, and that he could be appeased with a limited victory. Furthermore, unwilling to admit Bush's radical goals, moderates accepted at face value his administration's ever-shifting rationales for its unchanging policy. At first, tax cuts were about returning an excessive surplus to the people, and many Democratic senators, alas, voted for the 2001 tax cut on that basis. Then, as the surplus vanished, tax cuts were about providing short-run economic stimulus. Then, as it became clear that they weren't serving that purpose, tax cuts were about promoting long-run growth. Even now, many well-meaning politicians and journalists find it hard to face up to the truth. But what about the war? People who followed debates over foreign policy knew that an important faction of the right was as determined to have a war in the Middle East as another faction was to cut taxes. Back in 1992, Paul Wolfowitz, then Undersecretary of Defense and now Deputy Secretary, tried to make what is now known as the Bush Doctrine our official defense posture. The document he wrote called for intervention in Iraq and the legitimization of preemptive attacks on other countries. Dick Cheney, then Secretary of Defense, initially endorsed that view. He backed off in the face of public protest, but he and a number of other people, now in key administration positions, continued to agitate for an Iraq war and the adoption of preemption as a regular policy through the 1990s. Given this background, it was or should have been obvious that the proposed invasion of Iraq, like the tax cut, wasn't really a response to current events, in this case September 11th. It was part of a pre-existing and much more radical agenda. Yet, as in the case of the tax cut, the political and media establishment couldn't bring itself to accept that the right actually meant to pursue the goals it had declared. Instead, most people accepted as sincere the ever-shifting ostensible rationales offered by the Bush administration. A war with Iraq was at first justified by alleged ties between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. When no evidence was found for that link, despite intense efforts, the issue became Saddam's alleged nuclear program. The administration deliberately blurred the issue by stretching the term weapons of mass destruction to include chemical weapons. But poison gas isn't really in the same category and never posed a serious threat to the United States. What scared the public were visions of a mushroom cloud. Concerns about such a program helped convince many moderates that a war with Iraq was a good idea, and Congress gave Bush a green light to proceed with a war. Eventually, the case for believing in an Iraqi nuclear program was discredited. One of the two key pieces of evidence, Iraq's purchase of aluminum tubes, turned out to be a misinterpretation. The tubes weren't suitable for their alleged purpose, uranium enrichment. The other key piece, documents allegedly showing Iraqi purchases of uranium from Niger, were revealed to be inept forgeries. But by then, Bush was pushing the idea that America, by installing a democratic government in Iraq, would generate a wave of democratization across the region, an idealistic goal that, once again, drew support from many well-meaning moderates. Only once the war was well underway did James Woolsey, widely believed to be in line for a top post in the occupation government, declare the war in Iraq to be the start of a Fourth World War, with the Cold War as number 3, a conflict that would involve Syria and Iran as well as Iraq. There's a pattern here. In fact, pretty much the same story can be told about energy policy, environmental policy, healthcare policy, education policy, and so on. In each case, the officials making policy within the Bush administration have a history of highly radical views, which should suggest that the administration itself has radical goals. But in each case, the administration has reassured moderates by pretending otherwise, by offering rationales for its policy that don't seem all that radical. And in each case, moderates have followed a strategy of appeasement, trying to meet the administration halfway while downplaying both the radicalism of its policies and the trail of broken promises. The young Kissinger had it right. People who have been accustomed to stability can't bring themselves to believe what is happening when faced with a revolutionary power, and are therefore ineffective in opposing it. I should admit at this point that I am not entirely sure why this is happening, why we are now faced with such a radical challenge to our political and social system. Rich people did very well in the 1990s. Why this hatred of anything that looks remotely like income redistribution? Corporations have flourished. Why this urge to strip away modest environmental regulation? Churches of all denominations have prospered. Why this attack on the separation of church and state? American power and influence have never been greater. Why this drive to destroy our alliances and embark on military adventures? Nonetheless, it's increasingly clear that the right wants to do all these things. How should those of us who don't agree with its goals respond? Rules for reporting. The first step in these times is to understand what's going on. As a part-time journalist, I think of this in terms of rules for reporting, how to tell the story, but they apply equally to any concerned citizen trying to make sense of the news. 1. Don't assume that policy proposals make sense in terms of their stated goals. When you're dealing with a revolutionary power, it's important to realize that it knows what it wants and will make whatever argument advances that goal. So there should be no presumption that the claims it makes on behalf of its actions make any sense in their own terms. As I explained in Chapter 7, the Bush plan to privatize Social Security wasn't a dubious or ineffective way to strengthen the system's finances. It had absolutely nothing to do with that stated goal, and would actually have aggravated the system's problems. The tax cut proposals offered by the Bush administration in early 2003 were billed as a program to accelerate economic growth. Yet when the Congressional Budget Office, whose new head had, just months earlier, worked for the administration, tried to evaluate the growth effects of the proposal, it found little reason to think that they would be significantly positive. On a different front, most independent analysts expected a war with Iraq to increase, not reduce, the risk of terrorist attack. Journalists find it very hard to deal with blatantly false arguments. By inclination and training, they always try to see two sides to an issue, and find it hard even to conceive that a major political figure is simply lying about the content of his proposals. I hear that several journalists were very angry after I joked in my column that if Bush said that the world was flat, the headline on the news analysis would read, "Shape of Earth, Views Differ." Each of the angry journalists thought I was making fun of him. To be fair, when one is dealing with ordinary political movements, it makes sense to presume that their policy proposals, right or wrong, are made in good faith. But when one is dealing with a revolutionary movement, a movement that does not accept the legitimacy of the existing system, there's no reason to make that presumption. Revolutionary movements, which aren't concerned about the rules of the game, have no compunction about misrepresenting their goals. David Wessel of the Wall Street Journal wrote about a White House aide who said one thing on the record and the opposite off the record. When Wessel protested, the aide replied, "Why would I lie? Because that's what I'm supposed to do. Lying to the press doesn't prick anyone's conscience." 2. Do some homework to discover the real goals. There was no widely accepted economic theory, left or right, under which the type of tax cuts proposed in early 2003, which would gradually end taxes on capital income but pump very little money into the economy in the first year, made any sense as a way of creating jobs in the short run. Yet administration officials touted their plan as a job creation strategy. Were they misinformed? No, not really. Whatever those officials said, economic growth was not their goal. Moreover, it wasn't hard to figure out what the real goal was. As I pointed out earlier, radical conservatives have long advocated an end to all taxes on capital, and that's what the administration's proposal would in effect accomplish. So the way to understand the policy was to look at what its architects wanted before they tried to sell their plans to the public. This is a general principle for understanding what's happening. Do some homework to find out what these people really want. I'm not talking about deeply hidden motives. Usually the true goal is in the public domain. You just have to look at what the people pushing the policy said before they were trying to sell it to the broader public. When you learn that the official now in charge of forest policy is a former timber industry lobbyist, you can surmise that the Healthy Forests Initiative, under which logging companies will be allowed to cut down more trees, isn't about preventing forest fires. When you learn that the House Majority Leader has said that his purpose in office is to promote a biblical worldview, you can surmise that faith-based initiatives aren't mainly about delivering social services more effectively. When you learn that the architects of the Iraq War have wanted to topple Saddam Hussein for a decade, you can surmise that the war has nothing to do with responding to September 11th. Again, this is hard for journalists to deal with. They don't want to sound like crazy conspiracy theorists. But there's nothing crazy about ferreting out the real goals of the right wing. On the contrary, it's unrealistic to pretend that there isn't a sort of conspiracy here, albeit one whose organization and goals are pretty much out in the open. 3. Don't assume that the usual rules of politics apply. Washington has long had a routine for scandal. Some awkward facts come out about an official, and the press begins playing up the story. Soon the official is quietly urged to resign, and life goes on. So when various Bush administration officials began to have problems, people expected the same storyline, but it didn't happen. Stephen Griles, a coal industry lobbyist who was appointed Deputy Interior Secretary, intervened in an energy exploration dispute on behalf of a former client. He's still there. Thomas White, a former Enron executive, was appointed Secretary of the Army. Then his division of Enron was revealed to have been a source of phantom profits, but he's still there. Richard Pearl, chairman of the Defense Policy Advisory Board, was revealed to have business dealings that raised strong questions about conflict of interest, but he took only a token demotion from chairman to member and is still there. And both the president and vice president have, of course, brushed off concerns about their distinctly questionable business careers. Why don't the usual rules apply? Because a revolutionary power, which does not regard the existing system as legitimate, doesn't feel obliged to play by the rules. Are there hints of scandal regarding administration personnel? No matter. Fox News, the Washington Times, and the New York Post won't follow up on the story. Instead, they'll harass other media outlets if they try to make it an issue. Are there complaints about how Homeland Security is being handled? A sudden rash of terror alerts will drown out the story. But they wouldn't do that, protest reasonable people, and a normal regime wouldn't. But we're not dealing with a normal regime here. We're dealing with a revolutionary power. 4. Expect a revolutionary power to respond to criticism by attacking. A revolutionary power, which doesn't accept the legitimacy of the existing system, also doesn't accept the right of others to criticize its actions. Anyone who raises questions can expect a no-holds-barred counterattack. There was a spectacular example in April 2003. John Kerry, among the frontrunners for the next Democratic presidential nomination, told an audience that what we need now is not just a regime change in Saddam Hussein and Iraq, but we need a regime change in the United States. By the normal standards of political rhetoric, including wartime, this wasn't unusual. For example, in the 1944 election, that is, at the height of World War II, with millions of American servicemen slugging it out on multiple fronts, Thomas E. Dewey campaigned by calling Franklin Roosevelt a tired old man. As far as I know, nobody considered that treasonous. After all, you can't have free elections if you can't criticize the incumbent. And wasn't freedom what we were fighting for? The tradition of tolerance for criticism, even in times of war, has continued. For example, Tom DeLay was harshly critical of President Bill Clinton during the 1999 campaign in Kosovo, blaming Clinton for civilian deaths and urging a halt to the campaign. Some eyebrows were raised, but DeLay's career wasn't harmed. Now that a revolutionary power holds the White House, however, the rules have changed. Senator Kerry crossed a grave line when he dared to suggest the replacement of America's commander-in-chief at a time when America is at war, declared the chairman of the Republican National Committee, and dozens of Republican politicians piled on, questioning Kerry's patriotism. It so happens that Kerry is a decorated Vietnam veteran. Kerry's experience was only the latest in a series of episodes in which those who question or criticize the administration are demonized, their ethics questioned, their careers destroyed if possible. As I mentioned, the Republican Party ran ads linking Tom Daschle, the Democratic Senate leader, to Saddam Hussein. It successfully questioned the patriotism of Senator Max Cleland, who lost 3 limbs in Vietnam. All this was to be expected. The Bush administration has become notorious for its intolerance for dissent, even from those who are mostly on its side. According to the Washington Post, GOP lawmakers and lobbyists say the tactics the Bush administration uses on friends and allies have been uniquely fierce and vindictive. To some extent, this may reflect Bush family values, but it's also what you would expect from a revolutionary power. Here's a bit more from Kissinger. The distinguishing feature of a revolutionary power is not that it feels threatened, but that nothing can reassure it. Only absolute security, the neutralization of the opponent, is considered a sufficient guarantee. 5. Don't think that there's a limit to a revolutionary power's objectives. When the tax cut of 2001 was introduced, many moderates downplayed its significance, calling it a modest reversal of tax increases in the 1990s. Even if they didn't approve, they thought that it wasn't such a bad idea to let Bush have what he wanted. When the budget projections used to justify the tax cut proved wildly over-optimistic, moderates urged the administration to reconsider its plans, believing that it might listen and seek a compromise. The administration responded by pushing for even more tax cuts, and senators who had voted for the first round of tax cuts had a hard time explaining why they were opposed to more of the same. Only now is respectable opinion beginning to acknowledge that the administration's real goal, all along, was to eliminate taxation of capital income and sharply reduce, if not eliminate, the progressivity of the tax system, and that the initial appeasement by moderates removed the main obstacle toward that goal. Moreover, I'm not even sure that zero taxes on capital and a flat tax on wages mark the limits of the administration's ambitions. Poll taxes, anyone? Similarly, quite a few moderates supported a war on Iraq as a special case to deal with a dangerous, brutal dictator. But it has become increasingly clear that the administration's inner circle views the Iraq War as only a start on the Bush Doctrine, in which U.S. power will be used aggressively in much of the world. And having given in on the first step, moderates find it hard to explain why they don't support the overthrow of other dictators. Pax Americana, here we come. There must be limits somewhere to what the right will actually attempt to accomplish. It may move us to a tax system in which poor people pay a higher share of their income than rich people. But it won't take us to a system where rich people actually pay less than poor people, or will it? It may go on from Iraq to Syria and Iran, but it won't start threatening already democratic countries with military force, or will it? I don't know where the right's agenda stops, but I have learned never to assume that it can be appeased through limited concessions. Pundits who predict moderation on the part of the Bush administration on any issue have been consistently wrong. Kissinger again. It is the essence of a revolutionary power that it possesses the courage of its convictions, that it is willing, indeed eager, to push its principles to their ultimate conclusion. So that's the way it is. I suspect that many listeners, despite everything that has happened, will find it an alarmist picture. As Kissinger wrote, those who warn against the danger in time are considered alarmists. Those who counsel adaptation to circumstance are considered balanced and sane. But so far, the alarmists have been right every time. What can we do? The Great Revulsion. A growing number of people are starting to realize just how serious the situation is. Maybe Andy Rooney put it best. The only real good news will be when this terrible time in American history is over. What can bring that real good news closer? To hope for a turnaround, you have to believe that most Americans don't really support the right's agenda, that the country as a whole is more generous, more tolerant, and less militaristic than the people now running it. And I think that's true. But for the right's success in obscuring its aims and wrapping itself in the flag, I believe that most Americans would strongly oppose the direction this country is going. I have a vision, maybe just a hope, of a great revulsion, a moment in which the American people look at what is happening, realize how their goodwill and patriotism have been abused, and put a stop to this drive to destroy much of what is best in our country. How and when this moment will come, I don't know. But one thing is clear. It can't happen unless we all make an effort to see and report the truth about what is happening. Part 1. Bubble Trouble. Remember what it was like when it seemed as if the laws of business gravity had been repealed? Smart young people were dropping out of college and becoming multimillionaires on the spot. Companies you never heard of were suddenly worth $20 billion and were using their ultra-valuable stock to take control of businesses that had existed for generations. Anyone who owned shares, especially tech stocks, had won the lottery. Anyone who didn't felt a sense of loss, even shame. "What did you do in the bull market, Daddy?" asked my fellow Times columnist Maureen Dowd. Some people will tell you that the stock market boom of the 90s lies at the root of all our current troubles, that we are now paying the price for the bubble years. Although there's a grain of truth to that view, it's far from the whole story. As we'll hear later in this audiobook, long-run trends, growing economic and political polarization, the rising influence of a highly organized right wing, also helped set the stage for our present malaise. Specific events, above all September 11th, a crisis made for exploitation, also played an important role. And much of what has gone wrong reflects the character of the man in the White House. Still, you can't understand where we are today without recalling the illusions and excesses of the 90s. So this part of the audiobook is about irrational exuberance and its consequences. One puzzle is why so few people raised red flags as the Dow shot past 10,000 and the NASDAQ past 5,000. There were strong indications that stock prices were way out of line. Standard measures of stock valuation, like the price-earnings ratio, were far into what is normally considered the danger zone. And there were skeptics during the years of the surging market. I was one of them. Yet clever men in expensive suits invented all kinds of rationales for the market's ascent. Chapter 1 contains some of my attempts, going back to my pre-New York Times days, to demolish those rationales, and also to explain why normally sensible people got caught up in the frenzy. Those who were skeptical about stock prices weren't just worried that investors would lose money when the market regained touch with reality. They were concerned about collateral damage to the real economy. History contains some ominous lessons. The stock market bubble of the 1920s was followed by the crash of 1929, and that was followed by the Great Depression. Fortunately, the United States hasn't had to deal with a serious financial crisis since the 1930s, but other countries have had more recent experiences, and I know a fair bit about them. As an academic economist, I have been something of an ambulance chaser. Much of my research has focused on economies in trouble, from Indonesia to Japan. As a result, I knew, even before our bubble burst, that our experience in the 1930s was normal. A loss of financial confidence after a bull market often leads to a crisis in the real economy. Many economists were quite sure that it couldn't happen here, that the U.S. economy was immune to similar ills. I wasn't. In Chapter 2, I talk about economic crises abroad and their lessons for us. So how has the United States coped with the end of the bubble years? Even pessimists generally expected our economic leaders, above all Alan Greenspan, the legendary chairman of the Federal Reserve, to deal effectively with the economic consequences when stock prices returned to earth. But as an economist with an international perspective, I was all too aware of the history of Japan, the economic powerhouse of the world in the 1980s, but also the scene of one of history's great financial bubbles. And Japan's experience was a warning that we shouldn't take a happy ending for granted. When the Japanese stock market fell, that fall was followed by a protracted period of economic stagnation that continues to this day. In other words, even a highly advanced country with sophisticated leadership can stumble badly. And so it has turned out in the United States, which has experienced at least a touch of Japanese-style malaise. Chapter 3 chronicles the slide of the U.S. economy into recession and its tentative, inadequate return to growth. The usual term for growth too slow to reduce the unemployment rate is a jobless recovery, but I've always thought that the old term, growth recession, makes the point even better. It also chronicles my growing sense of disillusion with U.S. economic policy, as Greenspan's efforts proved inadequate, and the Bush administration doggedly refused to take the problem seriously. Part of the reason the aftermath of the 90s has been so troubled is that much more went wrong than a temporary overvaluation of stocks. In an era of ever-rising stock prices, hardly anyone noticed, but in the cold, clear light of the morning after, we can see that by the turn of the millennium, something was very rotten in the state of American capitalism. On this issue, I was no more perceptive than anyone else. During the bull market years, some people did send me letters claiming that major corporations were cooking their books, but, to my great regret, I ignored them. However, when Enron, the most celebrated company of its time, lauded as the very model of a modern business enterprise, blew up, I immediately saw the implications. If such a famous and celebrated company could have been a Ponzi scheme, it was very unlikely that the rest of U.S. business was squeaky clean. In fact, it quickly became clear that the bubble years were both the cause and effect of an epidemic of corporate malfeasance. Chapter 4 follows up on that revelation. It describes the motives for and techniques of business fraud. It also tells a story that many people don't want to hear, the extent to which our current political leadership is part of the problem. For it is a simple fact that George W. Bush and Dick Cheney got rich through pretty much the same tricks, albeit on a smaller scale, as those that enriched executives at Enron and other scandal-ridden corporations. That's part of a larger story. At a time when we really need another Franklin Roosevelt, we are instead led by men who are part of the problem. More on that later in the audiobook.